Georgie will start. Elize pala.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. We will start in about 2 to 3 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Reality versus Expectation, a roundtable discussion on BBM's 2023 SONA. This roundtable discussion is organized by the Program on Social and Political Change of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies and the Department of Political Science, University of the Philippines, Diliman. I am Assistant Professor Maria Elize Mendoza from the UP Department of Political Science, and I will be your moderator today. Mapapanood din ang RTD sa DZUP Facebook page at DZUP YouTube channel. Pwede rin po kayong mag-comment o magtanong. I-comment nyo lang po ito sa live stream sa Facebook o kaya sa YouTube. To formally open our program, may I call on Professor Teresa Encarnacion Tadem, Executive Director of UPCIDS and Professor at the UP Department of Political Science.
Thank you, Elize. Distinguished panel speakers, guests, colleagues, and friends, good afternoon. On behalf of the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or UPCIDS, I wish to welcome you all to this roundtable discussion, or RTD, on reality versus expectations, BBM's 2023 SONA, a roundtable discussion. As mentioned by Elize, this is sponsored by the UPCIDS Program on Social and Political Change and the UP Department of Political Science. This roundtable discussion, next slide please, is part of the activities of UPCIDS, which is the Research Policy Unit of the University of the Philippines. Founded in 1985 by then UP President Edgardo Angara, the UPCIDS is currently under the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs. Next slide, please. Okay. Since its inception, the UPCIDS has sought to encompass various perspectives, methodologies, and ideologies in its conduct of basic and policy-oriented research. Under the strategic trajectory of the university since 2017, next slide, please. UPCIDS, back slide please. UPCIDS aims to contribute to national development and knowledge creation through enhancing research, publications, and creative works. Its channels to implement this vision include workshops, lectures, forums, and RTDs, as we have this afternoon, as well as publications which include policy briefs, discussion papers, monographs, conference proceedings, and the Philippine Journal of Public Policy, Interdisciplinary Development Perspectives. These are all available in the UPC-IDS website and in print. To attain our UPC-IDS objectives, the Center presently has 12 programs which constitute the following clusters. We have the Education and Capacity Building Cluster, which consists of the Education Research Program, the Program on Higher Education Research and Policy Reform, the Assessment Curriculum and Technology Program, and the Program on Data Science for Public Policy. We also have the Development Cluster, which consists of the Program on Escaping the Middle Income Trap Chains for Change, Political Economy Program, Program on Alternative Development, and the Program on Health Systems Development. And lastly, the third cluster is the Social, Political, and Cultural Studies Cluster, which consists of the Program on Social and Political Change, our co-sponsor for this RTD, which consists of our co-convener, Maria Ella Atienza, who's one of our speakers, and also Jorge Tigno organized this forum as also co-convener. We also have the Islamic Studies Program, the Decolonial Studies Program, and the Strategic Studies Program. Among the UPC-IDS programs, it is, next slide please, it is the UPC-IDS program on social and political change, which provides a platform for understanding the varied social and political changes facing the modern Philippine society and polity from a multidisciplinary perspective. PSPC designs empirical studies which form the basis for policy inputs and discussions at the local, national, and international levels. In July 17, 2019, 4 years ago, the UPC-IDS sponsored a roundtable discussion on the Duterte administration at midterm, insights from the President's State of the Nation address, the proceedings of mga pahayag at sabi-sabi sa SONA 2019, a UP roundtable discussion. Spearheaded by the UPC-IDS program on social political change, this was participated on by 8 UPC-IDS programs and also co-sponsored by the UP Department of Political Science. 4 years later, we will now be listening to the SONA of President Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., or BBM, forging an alliance with Duterte's daughter Sara for Vice President. Both of them won by a landslide in millions, with BBM garnering 31 million of votes of the 75 million votes. His chief opponent garnered only half of this, 15 million votes. This is certainly, next slide please, This is, before that please. This is certainly a deja vu of the victory of his predecessor, Rodrigo Duterte, who won also by a landslide, that is 31.9% of the vote, over his chief presidential rival, Mar Rojas, who got 23.5% of the votes. The major campaign promise, however, seemed to be different. Duterte campaigned heavily on his war against drugs, while Marcos Jr. campaigned on the restoration of the golden age of his late father, the martial law era of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Despite this seemingly different campaign thrusts, the SONAs of both Duterte and BBM are examined within issues of urgency to the Filipino people. That is, the economy, governance. In relation to this, executive, legislative relations, civil society, and Philippine foreign relations, where the pivot of Duterte to China has seemed to be reversed by Marcos Jr., restoring Philippine ties with the U.S. We are fortunate to have with us today a panel of experts from the academe and civil society who will speak on these topics. I have no doubt that their presentations will generate an interesting and relevant dialogue during the open forum with regards to one of the major goals of this RTD, which is to provide for honest and open perspectives with regards to the first year of the Marcos presidency. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tadem. Now, to provide an overview of our discussion this afternoon, may I now call on Professor Jorge Tigno, co-convener of the UPCIDS Program on Social and Political Change and also a professor at the UP Department of Political Science.
Thank you, Elize, and good afternoon, everyone. Magandang hapon po. And I would like to join Tessa in welcoming you as well to, shall I say, the new University of the Philippines, specifically to the new Center for Integrative and Development Studies, where in the new program on social and political change, we are organizing this event on the new SONA that is about to happen maybe a week from now. I would also like to thank the speakers in advance for agreeing to touch on the many issues that you will hear them talk about this afternoon. I should also kind of issue a caveat here that the issues that have been lined up for us today is not that exhaustive. Okay, number one, because they only get a few minutes to speak at best, and number two, the issues are, there's still some other issues that I think we can also touch on in succeeding events, later events, maybe, specifically on the bureaucracy, on defense and security, although some of the speakers might touch on these issues as well in the course of their talks this afternoon. Well, just to give an overview of this particular event, since Tessa has already touched on the design of this roundtable to offer you a platform for having this kind of conversation happening. And this is incidentally the first time that we are doing this again face-to-face. First SONA isn't really supposed to be that remarkable, I think, because, it's the first SONA. You have a president who has just come in and is trying to learn the ropes. At best, what I think makes sense for a new administration is to try to rebrand itself and to make it distinct from the previous administrations. And that, I think, the new administration has done, has managed to do so far. Although I would have thought that it should have done this at the start, actually, of its term. But in any case, the title, of course, of this roundtable, Reality versus Expectations, speaks to that point in the term of an administration where you have this sense of perception of how it wants to project itself, and also what it has actually managed to do in its first year. So I'm not going to, since I'm not one of the panel, I'm only going to give you an overview, just sit back, and I hope that you can also take part in the discussions later on, including those who are participating via the live stream on Facebook. You can also turn in your questions and comments. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Professor Tigno. So we have a good lineup of speakers this afternoon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce all of them, and then we'll proceed with the discussion. And I think they're also seated in order of the discussion. So I'm going to introduce one by one our speakers this afternoon. First, to discuss the economy under BBM, we have Assistant Professor Giancarlo J.C. Punongbayan from the UP School of Economics. Dr. Punongbayan earned his PhD from the UP School of Economics in 2021, where he also graduated summa cum laude and valedictorian in 2009. He writes a weekly economics column for Rappler.com, He is also co-founder of Usapang Econ and co-host of Usapang Econ podcast. His first book, False Nostalgia, The Marcos Golden Age Myths and How to Debunk Them, was published by Ateneo University Press in February 2023. His research interests are macroeconomics, Philippine economic history, education economics, and development economics. Okay, so we have JC Punong Bayan. And then our second speaker to talk about BBM and Central Local Relations, we have Dr. Maria Ella Atienza, from a professor at the UP Department of Political Science and also co-convener of the UPCIDS program on social and political change. Dr. Ella Atienza was also a former chairperson of the Department of Political Science. She received her PhD in political science in 2003 from Kobe University in Japan. She teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on qualitative research methods, political science research, comparative politics, and local politics. So, and our third speaker, we have Joseph Puruganan, head of the Philippine Office of Focus on the Global South, to discuss civil society under a Marcos presidency. Focus on the Global South is a progressive policy research and campaign organization working on the themes of political economy of development, people's alternatives, power and democracy, climate, and gender justice. So Joseph spearheads Focus's work on trade and investment and corporate accountability. He is one of the conveners of the Trade Justice Pilipinas campaign platform and the Asian Task Force on the Binding Treaty, and he also coordinates the social justice campaign of In Defense of Human Rights and Dignity Movement, or iDefend. Our fourth speaker this afternoon to discuss BBM and executive legislative relations is Dr. Maria Fe Villamejor Mendoza, Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the UP National College of Public Administration and Governance. Dr. Villamejor Mendoza is also the interim president of the Philippine Public Policy Network, past president of the Pi Gamma Mu International Honor Society Philippine Alpha Chapter, and is included in the 1991 11th edition of the World's Who's Who of Women, published by the International Biographical Center, Cambridge, England. And last but not the least, to discuss Philippine foreign relations in the time of BBM, we have Dr. Maria Thay Marte Tana, co-convener of the UPCIDS Strategic Studies Program and associate professor at the UP Department of Political Science. Dr. Tay Tana obtained her PhD in Japanese Studies from the National University of Singapore and her MA in International Studies, major in European Studies from De La Salle University, Manila. Her research interests center on Japan-Southeast Asia relations, Japanese foreign policy, East Asian security, and human security. So everybody, a round of applause for our panelists this afternoon. All right, so to begin our discussion, we have Dr. Punong Bayan to discuss the economy under BBM.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Yes, I have a number of slides to share so that we can see the data when it comes to the economy during the first year of President Marcos. Okay, so next slide please. So the most distinguishing characteristic of the economy during the first year of President Marcos would be the runaway inflation rate, which reached a high of 8.7% in January of this year, the highest inflation rate in 14 years. Of course, since then, the inflation rate has already gone down to more than 5%. However, the inflation rate has gone down on its own, and actually, this is still way above the 4% upper target of the government when it comes to inflation. And most importantly, even if inflation has its global factors, for example, supply chain disruptions, the Marcos administration really could have done more by way of bringing down the inflation rate more toward the target of upper target of 4%. Next slide. So actually, we were in the weird situation where the headline inflation rate is actually below the core inflation rate. So the core inflation rate is inflation when you remove food and energy items, and it was actually higher than the headline inflation rate. So this kind of tells you that the inflation rate, even if half of inflation is due to food, non-food items including electricity, rent, also contributed a lot to inflation during the first year of President Marcos. And yes, next slide. The main campaign promise when it comes to the economy was the 20 pesos per kilogram of rice. But as you can see from this graph, we are still far above that target of 20 pesos. In fact, the average retail price of rice, regular milled or well milled, is still above 40 pesos per kilogram. So about double the target or the promise of President Marcos. Next slide. So as I said, half of inflation was due to food, and over the past several months, we saw, for example, onions reached a high of 200% inflation rate, whereas the average inflation rate was just about 7% or 8% at one point. Onions had 200% inflation. Other items include vegetables, sugar, bread, and flour also experienced high inflation rates during the first year of President Marcos. And in fact, the president is if you think of it, he's in a very good position to try to bring down food inflation, being the agriculture secretary himself. If we look at the policy responses, next slide, please. So when it comes to inflation, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas has been doing its part in terms of increasing its policy interest rate, which means that they are basically making it more expensive for people to take out new loans for their new houses or new cars or new businesses. However, that action of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas can only do so much, and actually they were pleading other government agencies to do their part and implement non-monetary measures. And the president, again, should have done a lot more. They implemented the greater proliferation of kadiwa stores. However, that remained to be inaccessible to many Filipinos. And they also resorted to importation. However, it was not a surefire way to reduce inflation because, in fact, the sugar orders, for example, of the Sugar Regulatory Administration, they have still not imported that amount of sugar. And the existence of cartels and the imperfect competition also impedes the reduction of food prices even with greater importation. Next slide. So in 2022, GDP also increased by 7.6%. That's the highest growth rate of the economy since 1976. However, this masks the scars brought about by the pandemic. In fact, if we want to go back to the economy's pre-pandemic trajectory, we will require a growth rate of about, more than 9% annually. And in fact, you can say that the pandemic really brought down the trajectory of the economy permanently, to the extent that the current growth rates of 7.6%, for example, will not be nearly enough for us to go back to the pre-pandemic